In the quiet, picturesque neighborhood of Willow Creek, life moved at a predictable pace. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted houses, and flower beds bursting with color gave the impression of a community that valued order above all else. This was no accident. It was the result of the Homeowners Association, HOA, an organization that prided itself on enforcing strict rules to maintain the neighborhood's charm. From regulating mailbox colors to dictating the exact height of hedges, the HOA had its fingers in every aspect of life in Willow Creek. Most residents accepted these rules without complaint, grateful for the sense of harmony they brought to the area. However, not everyone was entirely happy with the HOA's decisions. At the edge of the neighborhood, tucked away behind a line of trees, sat a small retention pond. It wasn't much to look at, just a shallow basin surrounded by grass, but it played a crucial role in managing rainwater runoff during storms. For years, the pond had quietly done its job, preventing floods and keeping the streets dry. But recently, something had changed. The HOA, eager to boost property values, decided to redirect funds earmarked for maintaining the pond toward more aesthetically pleasing projects. A new fountain in the Central Park, decorative lampposts lining the main road, and elaborate flower arrangements became their priorities. The retention pond, hidden from view and rarely thought about, fell by the wayside. At first, no one noticed the neglect. The pond still looked functional enough, though weeds had begun creeping up along its edges. Small cracks appeared in the embankment and sediment slowly accumulated at the bottom, reducing its capacity to hold water. But these changes went largely ignored because for years, the weather had been mild. Rainstorms came and went without causing any real trouble, reinforcing the HOA's belief that spending money on the pond was unnecessary. Then came the whispers. A handful of residents started raising concerns when meteorologists began predicting unusually heavy rainfall for the upcoming season. One evening, during a routine HOA meeting, a man named Tom stood up to voice his worries. "The pond hasn't been cleaned out in years," he said, pointing to photos he'd taken of the overgrown vegetation and cracked edges. "If we get a big storm, it might not be able to handle the water. We could have flooding." His words were met with polite nods but little action. The HOA president, a stern woman named Margaret, dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Tom, you're worrying unnecessarily," she replied. "That pond has been there for decades, and it's never caused problems before. Besides, we need to focus our resources where they'll make the biggest impact, on things people can actually see." Others chimed in, agreeing with Margaret. After all, who wanted to spend money on something as unglamorous as a retention pond? Surely, the weather wouldn't be that bad this year, and so the matter was dropped, leaving Tom frustrated but powerless to do anything about it. As days turned into weeks, the skies remained clear, and the issue faded from most people's minds. Children played outside, neighbors exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences, and everything seemed normal. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Some residents couldn't shake off the unease they felt about the neglected pond. Sarah Thompson, a young mother of two, found herself staring at the dark clouds gathering on the horizon one afternoon. She lived close enough to the pond that she could hear the faint rustle of leaves near its banks whenever the wind picked. Something about it felt wrong. Sarah tried to push the thought aside, telling herself she was being paranoid. Still, she made a mental note to talk to Tom later. He seemed like someone who might share her concerns. Little did she know those ominous clouds were harbingers of something far greater than anyone anticipated. Unbeknownst to the residents of Willow Creek, nature was preparing to deliver a powerful reminder of what happens when humans underestimate its force. The calm facade of their idyllic neighborhood masked a ticking time bomb, waiting for just the right moment to explode into chaos. For now, though, life carried on as usual. Families gathered for barbecues, dogs barked in backyards, and cars rolled smoothly down freshly paved streets. The retention pond continued to sit quietly, its silent deterioration unnoticed by all but a few. But soon, the balance would shift, and the consequences of ignoring the warning signs would become impossible to ignore. The storm that hit Willow Creek was unlike anything the residents had ever seen. It began innocently enough, a light drizzle that tapped gently against windows and glistened on rooftops. At first, people welcomed the rain. After weeks of dry heat, it felt refreshing. Children splashed in puddles as parents watched from porches, sipping coffee and enjoying the break from the summer sun. But by the second day, the mood shifted. The gentle patter turned into a relentless downpour, pounding roofs and flooding streets with water that seemed to have no end. Meteorologists issued warnings about an incoming weather system they were calling historic. Rivers swelled beyond their banks, and low-lying areas across the region reported flash floods. In Willow Creek, the ground quickly became saturated, unable to absorb any more water. Gutters overflowed, and small streams formed along sidewalks carrying leaves, twigs, and debris. Still, most residents remained optimistic, trusting that their neighborhood would stay safe. After all, Willow Creek had always been protected from such disasters, or so they thought. By the third day, the situation grew dire. The skies darkened to an eerie gray, and thunder rumbled constantly, shaking the foundations of homes. Lightning illuminated the horizon in jagged bursts, casting long shadows over the flooded streets. Power lines sagged under the weight of the wind and rain, and some neighborhoods lost electricity entirely. Candles flickered in windows, and generators hummed faintly in backyards. The once pristine lawns were now muddy swamps dotted with toys and garden tools swept away by rising waters. And then came the moment everyone dreaded. The retention pond gave way. It happened late at night, when exhaustion had set in, and hope was beginning to wane. The embankment, weakened by years of neglect, finally succumbed to the immense pressure of water pushing against it. With a sound like tearing fabric, the barrier collapsed, releasing a torrent of water that surged through the neighborhood like a runaway train. Residents woke to the roar of rushing water, scrambling out of bed in panic. Some barely had time to grab their loved ones before fleeing their homes. Sarah Thompson was one of the first to realize what was happening. She'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when she heard the unmistakable crash of water breaking free. Her heart raced as she ran to her window and saw the floodwaters barreling toward her house. Without hesitation, she woke her husband and children, shouting instructions over the chaos. They grabbed blankets, phones, and whatever else they could carry before rushing outside. The scene was apocalyptic. Cars floated down streets like boats. Mailboxes bobbed in the current, and entire sections of fences were ripped from the ground. As the floodwaters spread, fear rippled through the community. Neighbors banged on doors, urging others to evacuate while there was still time. Elderly couples clung to each other as volunteers helped them navigate waist-deep water. Pets yelped and barked, confused and terrified by the sudden upheaval. For many, the shock of losing everything they owned was too much to process in the moment. All they could do was focus on survival. The devastation wasn't limited to just physical property. Friendships fractured under the weight of blame and anger. Those who had warned the HOA about the pond's condition earlier now confronted its members demanding answers. Tom, the man who had raised concerns during the HOA meeting, stood ankle-deep in water outside his home, watching as his prized woodworking shop disappeared beneath the waves. His face was a mixture of grief and fury. "I told them this would happen," he shouted to anyone within earshot. "They didn't listen." Margaret, the HOA president, looked visibly shaken as she waded through the wreckage alongside other board members. Her usually immaculate appearance was gone, replaced by disheveled hair and mud-streaked clothes. Reporters swarmed the area, capturing images of the destruction and asking pointed questions about the HOA's role in the disaster. Margaret stammered through interviews, trying to defend her decisions but failing to convince anyone of her sincerity. The public backlash was swift and merciless. For days, the rain continued, compounding the misery. Cleanup efforts were impossible until the water receded, leaving residents stranded in shelters or with friends and family outside the flood zone. The sense of betrayal ran deep. People who had trusted the HOA to protect their interests now felt abandoned and deceived. Conversations buzzed with accusations and recriminations. Why didn't they fix the pond? How could they ignore the warnings? Who's going to pay for this? Amid the chaos, stories of resilience began to emerge. A local church opened its doors to provide food and shelter for displaced families. Teenagers organized fundraisers, setting up lemonade stands and bake sales despite the gloomy weather. Even strangers stepped up to help, offering spare rooms or donating supplies. These acts of kindness offered a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation, reminding everyone that even in the darkest times, humanity could shine through. But the scars left by the flood were undeniable. Homes were destroyed, memories washed away, and trust shattered. As the waters finally began to subside, revealing the full extent of the damage, the residents of Willow Creek faced a daunting reality. Rebuilding wouldn't just mean repairing houses. It would mean confronting the mistakes that led to this catastrophe in the first place. And for many, it was clear that the HOA bore the brunt of the responsibility. The question now was whether justice would be served, and if the community could ever truly recover from the chaos unleashed by nature and human negligence. As the floodwaters finally began to recede, the true scale of the devastation in Willow Creek became impossible to ignore. What was once a pristine neighborhood now resembled a war zone. Roads were caked with thick mud and piles of debris, broken furniture, soggy carpets, shattered glass, lined the streets. The air carried a damp, musty smell that clung to everything, making it hard to breathe without feeling a pang of despair. Homes stood like skeletons, their walls stripped bare or entirely collapsed. Toys lay scattered in driveways, their bright colors dulled by layers of grime. It was as if a giant hand had swept through the community, leaving behind only fragments of what used to be. The emotional toll was just as heavy as the physical damage. Families gathered in front of their ruined houses, staring blankly at the wreckage. Some cried openly, while others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how their lives had been upended so suddenly. Sarah Thompson wandered through her home, stepping carefully over warped floorboards and soggy insulation. Her children's drawings still clung to the refrigerator, but the fridge itself no longer worked. Everything smelled of mildew, and the thought of salvaging even a fraction of their belongings felt overwhelming. She tried to stay strong for her kids, but inside she felt hollow, betrayed not just by nature but by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Anger simmered beneath the surface, bubbling closer to boiling point with each passing day. Residents gathered in small groups, sharing stories of loss and frustration. Conversations inevitably turned to blame, and fingers pointed squarely at the HOA. "They ignored us," Sarah said during one such gathering, her voice trembling with emotion. "We told them this could happen, and they didn't care. They cared more about flower beds than keeping us safe." Her words struck a chord, earning nods of agreement from those around her. Others chimed in with their own grievances, recounting instances where the HOA had brushed off concerns about infrastructure or dismissed suggestions for practical improvements. Social media amplified the outrage, turning local frustration into a national conversation. Photos of the flooded streets and destroyed homes spread rapidly online, accompanied by captions slamming the HOA's negligence. Hashtags like HOA fail and Willow Creek betrayed trended on Twitter, drawing attention from news outlets across the country. Reporters descended on Willow Creek, eager to capture interviews with residents and document the aftermath. Margaret, the HOA president, found herself under relentless scrutiny. Cameras followed her wherever she went, capturing every awkward pause and defensive response as she struggled to explain the association's decisions. Her polished demeanor crumbled under the weight of public condemnation. The backlash wasn't limited to social media and news coverage. Lawsuits began pouring in, filed by homeowners seeking compensation for their losses. Insurance claims revealed another layer of trouble. Many policies didn't cover flood damage because the HOA had failed to classify the retention pond as a flood risk. This oversight left countless families facing financial ruin. Tom, whose woodworking shop had been completely destroyed, led the charge in organizing a class action lawsuit against the HOA. He spent hours poring over documents, gathering evidence, of the association's mismanagement and rallying support from his neighbors. "This isn't just about money," he told anyone who would listen. "It's about accountability. Someone needs to pay for what happened here." Margaret and the other HOA board members scrambled to defend themselves, but their efforts only made matters worse. In an attempt to shift blame, they issued a statement claiming that the storm was an unforeseeable act of God, rather than the result of their negligence. The phrase ignited a firestorm of criticism. "Unforeseeable?" Sarah shot back, during a televised interview. "We warned them. We showed them pictures of the cracked embankment. How can they call this unforeseeable when we literally begged them to fix it?" Public pressure mounted, forcing several board members to resign, in shame. Margaret, however, refused to step down, insisting that she had acted in the best interest of the community. Her stubbornness further alienated her from the residents, who saw her refusal as a sign of arrogance and denial. Protest signs appeared outside the HOA office demanding her removal. One particularly bold group of teenagers spray-painted, "Fix your mess" on the building's facade, a stark reminder of the growing resentment toward the association. Amid the chaos, tensions within the community also flared. While most residents united in their anger toward the HOA, some cracks began to form. A few homeowners, desperate to move on, argued that pursuing legal action would drag out the recovery process and delay rebuilding efforts. Others accused these individuals of being selfish or too quick to forgive. Arguments broke out at town hall meetings, turning what should have been productive discussions into shouting matches. Despite these divisions, the majority of residents remained determined to hold the HOA accountable. For them, justice wasn't just about reclaiming lost property, it was about ensuring that something like this could never happen again. In the midst of all this turmoil, volunteers continued to work tirelessly to clean up the neighborhood. Strangers came together to shovel mud, haul away debris, and offer whatever help they could. Local businesses donated supplies, and churches organized food drives to support displaced families. These acts of kindness provided a lifeline for those struggling to cope with the disaster. Sarah often found herself overwhelmed by the generosity of her neighbors, even as she seethed with anger toward the HOA. It was a strange duality, feeling both gratitude and bitterness simultaneously, but it kept her going. As weeks turned into months, the fight for accountability gained momentum. Legal teams representing the residents prepared to take the HOA to court, armed with irrefutable evidence of negligence. Meanwhile, the HOA's assets were frozen pending the outcome of the lawsuits, effectively crippling its ability to function. Projects that had once symbolized the association's priorities, like the fountain in the park and the decorative lampposts, sat unfinished, serving as grim reminders of misplaced values. The irony was not lost on anyone. For Sarah and others, like her, the road ahead was uncertain. Rebuilding would take time, effort, and resources they weren't sure they had. But one thing was clear. The flood had awakened something in the community, a fierce determination to demand better leadership, prioritize practical needs over superficial aesthetics, and ensure that their voices would never be ignored again. The scars left by the disaster ran deep, but they also served as a catalyst for change. And though the pain lingered, there was a glimmer of hope, a belief that Willow Creek could rise from the ruins stronger and wiser than before. The months following the flood were a whirlwind of activity in Willow Creek, as residents worked tirelessly to rebuild not just their homes, but also their sense of community. The anger that had initially consumed everyone began to transform into something more constructive, a shared determination to create lasting change. Sarah Thompson, who had emerged as one of the most vocal leaders in the aftermath of the disaster, found herself at the center of this movement. Alongside Tom and other neighbors, she spearheaded efforts to dismantle the old Homeowners Association, HOA, and replace it with a new system, one that prioritized transparency, accountability, and practical solutions over vanity projects. The legal battle against the HOA continued to dominate headlines, drawing widespread attention far beyond Willow Creek's borders. Lawyers representing the residents presented damning evidence during court proceedings, Emails showing how funds meant for maintaining the retention pond had been redirected, photographs documenting years of neglect, and expert testimony confirming that the flood could have been mitigated with proper maintenance. Margaret, the former HOA president, sat stiffly in the courtroom, her face pale and drawn. She tried to defend her decisions, arguing that the association had always acted in good faith, but her arguments fell flat. Even some of her former allies on the board distanced themselves from her, hoping to salvage what little credibility they still had. By the time the judge delivered the verdict, tensions were running high. The court ruled decisively in favor of the residents, ordering the HOA to pay millions in damages. This decision effectively bankrupted the organization, leaving its once imposing office building empty and abandoned. For many residents, the ruling was a bittersweet victory. While it provided some measure of justice, it couldn't undo the trauma or fully compensate for the lives upended by the flood. Still, there was a collective sigh of relief. Finally, someone was being held accountable. With the HOA dissolved, the question became, what would take its place? Residents knew they needed structure, but they were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. A series of town hall meetings brought people together to discuss ideas for a new governing body. These gatherings weren't without their challenges. Emotions still ran high and disagreements occasionally erupted into heated debates. But slowly, a vision began to emerge. Instead of an all-powerful HOA making top-down decisions, the community opted for a democratically elected council. Each member would represent different blocks of the neighborhood, ensuring diverse voices were heard. Sarah threw herself into the process, helping draft guidelines for the new council's operations. Transparency was key. Meetings would be open to the public, budgets would be published online, and regular updates would keep residents informed about ongoing projects. Practicality also took precedence over aesthetics. Gone were the days of prioritizing decorative lampposts while ignoring critical infrastructure. The first order of business? Rebuilding and reinforcing the retention pond. This project became a symbol of renewal for Willow Creek. Volunteers flocked to the site, eager to contribute in any way they could. Engineers designed stronger embankments while landscapers added native plants to prevent erosion. The pond itself was dredged and expanded, increasing its capacity to handle future storms. Families gathered on weekends to plant trees around its perimeter, creating a buffer zone that doubled as a small park. It was hard work, but it brought people closer together. Neighbors who had barely spoken before the flood now laughed and joked as they worked side by side, united by a common goal. As the physical landscape of Willow Creek transformed, so too did its social fabric. The flood had exposed deep flaws in the community, not just in its infrastructure but in how people related to one another. In the wake of the disaster, walls came down. Longtime residents reached out to newcomers, offering help and support. Teenagers organized events to raise money for those still struggling financially, while older residents shared stories and wisdom over coffee at impromptu gatherings. The sense of isolation that had quietly crept into the neighborhood under the HOA's rigid rule gave way to a spirit of collaboration and mutual care. Tom, whose woodworking shop had been destroyed, found solace in rebuilding, not just his business, but also his connection to the community. With donations of tools and materials from neighbors, he set up a temporary workshop in his garage. There he crafted furniture for families whose homes were still being repaired, refusing payment for his work. "We're all in this together," he said simply when someone offered him money. His generosity inspired others to follow suit, sparking a chain reaction of kindness that rippled through the neighborhood. Even Margaret, whose reputation had been tarnished beyond repair, found redemption in unexpected ways. Stripped of her position and ostracized by many, she quietly volunteered her time to assist with cleanup efforts. At first, people avoided her, unsure of her intentions. But as weeks passed, her sincerity became evident. She worked long hours, alongside everyone else hauling debris and planting trees. Though she never sought forgiveness, her actions spoke volumes, earning her a tentative acceptance back into the fold. By the end of the year, Willow Creek bore little resemblance to the neighborhood it had been before the flood. New flood barriers stood tall near the retention pond, a testament to lessons learned the hard way. Streets were repaved, houses rebuilt, and gardens replanted. Yet the changes went deeper than appearances. The community had undergone a profound shift, a reimagining of what it meant to live together in harmony. Gone was the emphasis on perfection and conformity. Instead, there was room for imperfection, individuality, and growth. For Sarah, standing beside the newly restored retention pond one crisp autumn morning, the transformation felt surreal. Her children played nearby, laughing as leaves swirled around them in the breeze. She thought back to the night of the flood, the fear, the chaos, the heartbreak, and marveled at how far they'd come. Yes, scars remained. Some homes still bore visible signs of damage, and memories of loss lingered. But there was also hope, a belief that Willow Creek could thrive again, stronger and wiser than ever. The flood had been a tragedy, no doubt, but it had also been a catalyst, a force that shook the foundations of the community and forced it to rebuild from the ground up. And though no one wished to relive those dark days, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the disaster had given them something valuable, a chance to start anew. The story of Willow Creek didn't end with the rebuilding of homes or the restoration of the retention pond. It evolved into something far greater, a testament to resilience, unity, and the power of collective action. As time passed, the scars left by the flood began to fade, not just from the landscape but also from the hearts of its residents. Yet the lessons learned during those tumultuous months remained etched deeply in their memories, shaping the way they lived, governed, and cared for one another. 1 year after the disaster, the community came together to host a commemorative event at the newly renovated retention pond. What had once been a neglected, muddy basin was now a vibrant centerpiece of the neighborhood. The embankments were reinforced with sturdy stone walls, and native plants framed the water's edge, attracting birds and butterflies. A small walking path wound around the pond, lined with benches where families could sit and enjoy the view. At the entrance stood a plaque engraved with words chosen by Sarah and other residents. In memory of what we lost, and in gratitude for what we've gained, hundreds of people attended the gathering, filling the air with laughter, music, and conversation. Children ran barefoot along the grass, their giggles echoing across the park. Food trucks served barbecue and fresh lemonade, while local musicians played cheerful tunes on guitars and fiddles. It was a celebration, not just of survival but of growth. For many, it marked a turning point, a moment when they could finally look back on the flood without feeling overwhelmed by grief or anger. During the ceremony, Sarah stepped up to speak. Her voice wavered slightly as she began, but soon her words flowed with conviction. "This place almost destroyed us," she admitted, gesturing toward the pond. "But it also taught us something important, that we're stronger together than we are apart. We've learned to listen to each other, to value practicality over pretense, and to take care of the things that truly matter." She paused, scanning the crowd. Faces young and old gazed back at her, nodding in agreement. Some wiped away tears while others smiled through them. "We'll never forget what happened here," she continued. "But let this be a reminder that even in our darkest moments we have the power to rebuild and to do it better than before." Her speech earned a standing ovation, followed by applause that seemed to go on forever. When the clapping finally subsided, Tom took the stage to share his own reflections. He spoke about how the flood had forced him to confront his own fears, of failure, of loss, of being forgotten. "I used to think my worth was tied to my workshop," he said, holding up a wooden carving he'd made earlier that week. "But I've realized that my real value lies in the connections I make with all of you. That's what keeps me going." His words resonated deeply, especially among those who had struggled the most in the aftermath of the flood. Many residents had faced challenges they never imagined, losing heirlooms, dealing with insurance battles, or coping with the emotional toll of displacement. Yet, through it all, they had leaned on one another, finding strength in shared experiences. This sense of solidarity became the cornerstone of the new Willow Creek. The Democratic Council, formed in the wake of the HOA's dissolution, proved to be a model of effective governance. Monthly meetings were well attended, with residents actively participating in discussions about everything from road repairs to holiday decorations. Decisions were made collaboratively, ensuring that everyone felt heard. Budgets were transparent, posted online for anyone to review, and funds were allocated based on need rather than appearance. Practical projects, like improving storm drains and planting trees to reduce erosion, took priority over superficial enhancements. Even Margaret, whose name had once been synonymous with negligence, found a role in the new system. Though she no longer held any official position, she volunteered her organizational skills to help coordinate community events. Her quiet dedication slowly earned her a measure of forgiveness, though she rarely sought recognition. Instead, she focused on contributing in ways that mattered, proving that redemption was possible even after the gravest mistakes. As the years went by, Willow Creek transformed into a beacon of resilience for neighboring towns. Visitors often remarked on the warmth and inclusivity of the community, noting how neighbors greeted each other by name and offered help without hesitation. Local schools incorporated lessons about the flood into their curriculum, teaching children about the importance of preparedness, teamwork, and accountability. Even the media revisited the story periodically, highlighting how a tragedy had sparked positive change. Yet life wasn't without its challenges. New storms rolled in, testing the improvements made to the neighborhood's infrastructure. But unlike before, the residents approached these events with confidence, knowing they had taken every precaution to protect themselves. Emergency response. Plans were in place and communication channels ensured that everyone stayed informed. When heavy rains hit, volunteers patrolled the streets, checking on vulnerable neighbors and clearing blocked drains. The retention pond, now a symbol of hope rather than neglect, performed flawlessly, holding back waters that might otherwise have caused chaos. For Sarah, the journey came full circle when her youngest child asked her why the pond was so special. Sitting on a bench overlooking the water, she explained how it had once been the source of their greatest fear, but had since become a source of pride. It reminds us that sometimes bad things happen because people make mistakes, she told him. But it also shows us that we can fix those mistakes if we work together. Her son nodded thoughtfully, then skipped off to join his friends playing nearby. Watching him, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for her family, for her neighbors, and for the second chance they'd been given. The flood had changed them all, leaving behind a legacy of resilience that would guide future generations. Willow Creek was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a living example of what could be achieved when people chose to rise above adversity. The flood had unleashed chaos, yes, but it had also unleashed potential. And in doing so, it had created something extraordinary, a community bound not by rules but by trust, compassion, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of renewal.